Hey there, we're going to introduce you to some great techniques by Naya Wolfe in her new book, Cozy Cafés. What's really great about this book is that it gives you a variety of cafes to paint in a range of different colors. Naya is using a 2 and 6 Kalia round. In addition, she has a ceramic palette and a series of beautiful colors. Permanent rose, ultramarine blue, Payne's gray, cerulean blue, sap green, and burnt umber are the primary palette that she's using. She's taking a little bit of burnt umber here and thinning it down with some water to create a wash. You don't need to put too much water in this color because we want to make sure that we get a nice even coat of coverage on the wood grain of this Cozy Café. She's using a paper towel to dab off the excess color and beginning in the shadow areas. Naya is applying the color in the upper shadow area, wiping the brush a little bit and then dragging that color downward to control how much color is in the brush and on the surface. She's laying a fairly even wash in place. That's going to give us some nice base layering for us to be able to shade over top of. You'll notice that Naya is using the point of the brush to create the shape in the refined areas and then just allowing the color to flow out from it. Burnt umber is a beautiful, rich brown tone that will layer in a gorgeous way, so you'll be able to get beautiful darks and nice even coverage in your mid-tones. She's going to continue taking this burnt umber color to paint the framing all the way around the window. Working on the right side, coming up underneath where those little flowers would be and moving that color downward. One of the important techniques that we use at Willow Wolfe is to follow the direction of what we're painting. So in the case of wood grain, she's mimicking the idea with the strokes that it is growing in a vertical manner. And by growing, we mean that the grain is in that direction. You'll often notice on something that is wider at the bottom will flow from left to right or right to left. One of the reasons for that is that if the painting begins to dry while we're working on it, we've established shape, direction, and dimension already. So if it dried in the middle of blending for some reason, it would look as though it was intended to be that way. Naya's working on one of our favorite kitchen supplies, which is a Lazy Susan, which makes it super easy to be able to rotate your painting to get just the angle that you want. We're going to come in here and begin the roof area just above that awning. It's good to establish a nice crisp edge where the awning sits and make sure that, again, we are moving in the direction of the wood grain. The paper that we're using is what we call our studio watercolor paper line. It isn't 100% cotton. What that means is that it will dry a little bit quicker than our premium papers dry. That's fine because what we do here is we will often come in and apply a wash or a light layer and then layer over top with strokes to build depth and dimension. This watercolor paper texture is more similar to a hot press than a cold press, and what that means is that it is not as textured as cold press watercolor paper. It's going to have smoother lines, and we do that because if you ever decide to ink over top of your painting or underneath it with a pen and ink technique, it's really smooth and beautiful to work on. You can also add additional embellishments onto the book using stamps or stencils and play around, and that smooth finish is really beneficial. Our Calia rounds at Willow Wolfe are a synthetic sable. So we don't believe in using any natural hair in any of our brushes. So what you'll notice here is that the brush is built beautifully with a multi-diameter blend of synthetic. The synthetic filaments in the brush allow the paint and water to distribute evenly throughout the filaments and yet maintain a beautiful, perfect point. That's going to allow Naya to get into those tiny little areas and also allow her to move the paint and color for a significant period of time. So a great brush is really, really important for watercolor painting. Naya is essentially applying the shadow on the left-hand side of each of these little squares and then moving it outward. In this case, she's just got a light wash in the background. This is just your first layer. There's then shading to go over top of this layer. Often when we're glazing additional layers onto a surface, you want to let it dry for 5 to 10 minutes first. I see that Naya here is getting that layer on fairly quickly. That works because the watercolor isn't overly wet. Sometimes though, if you move too fast and put your second layer on, you'll lift the layers underneath. In this case, because of the technique she's using, where she's actually stroking the color onto the surface, she's making sure that it sits on top of that first layer. And that next shadow is going underneath the awning sections, and anywhere that the section of the painting is partially covered by something else would be where you would add your shadow and then drag it in the direction of the wood grain. This Cozy Café window is very, very sweet and reminiscent essentially of the cafes that we would see in Europe and in France. And quite often you'll see on the streets of France, where we just were, that there are whole rows of cafes and shops in a complete range of different colors. So you really have the flexibility and freedom with these books to either follow our palette that you see listed there and our instructions, or to kind of do what you want and paint your cozy cafes in any color. So you could imagine that the wood is painted yellow, peach, brown, beautiful colors, or you can follow the instructions that we have and paint them in a similar way. It really is up to your imagination. We're still layering some of that burnt umber onto the surface here in different sections. Naya is right-handed, so for a right-handed person, you're going to be able to swivel the project and get into some of those areas on each side using the Lazy Susan. And similarly, for a left-handed person, the Lazy Susan is also exceptionally handy to be able to turn the project. You don't have to keep the book open the whole time. Sometimes people cut out the pages, and other times they simply fold the back over and kind of let themselves use their imagination. The more water you add, the more transparent the color is. The less water you add, the more opaque and dark that burnt umber will look. So for the second layer, Naya has used less water so that the paint goes on in a much darker, more opaque manner. Burnt umber is a really rich brown. There's still some warmth to it, a little bit of a reddish hue, but not nearly as much as burnt sienna. So what Naya's doing here is layering that warm color layer after layer, and it's just going to continue to get deeper in the darkest areas. It's kind of amazing how much depth and dimension you can get with just 2 brushes. You don't need a lot of brushes to paint in watercolor. We're going to thin down a little bit of ultramarine blue, make it a little bit transparent, and begin our awning. Naya is beginning on the left side of the awning to establish that first layer of ultramarine blue. She applies the color on the left and works the color outward toward the middle of the awning, imagining that there is a lighter tone on the right-hand side of it. So you can see she's actually blending color as she goes, very loosely and in a very relaxed manner. A lot of people get very stressed about blending watercolor. They feel like it has to be a perfect wash or a perfect gradient, but it doesn't. So it's sometimes equally as beautiful just to allow the color to move itself over from one side to the other. She's doing the front of this awning now, darker color on the left, following that scallop shape with the fine tip of the calia round and moving the color over to the other side, blending it out as she goes. You can either allow this layer to completely dry, which is often a good rule of thumb to ensure that you don't lift the layer that you put on right after it. When it comes to techniques that Naya uses, because she often uses various strokes to paint, she kind of went back to the top of the awning right away and began to layer that second coat of color. It's not lifting the color underneath, which is fantastic. You just want to make sure that you don't press too hard to keep that rich, vibrant color on top. You'll also notice that sometimes if you want to take away some of the color that you've added, you can rinse the brush, blot on paper towel to make sure you've removed the paint, and kind of work back into the color to lift any color you want to take away out. On the other side, Naya's applying just a little bit of a shadow underneath the tree area there. Beautiful. I envision them to be cherry blossoms, beautiful pink blossoms kind of crawling up around this gorgeous cafe window. Whatever plant or climbing tree that you're envisioning, you can paint it in any color you want. She's just putting a little bit of shadow beneath it in that ultramarine blue. And a fairly opaque ultramarine blue, opaque meaning less water, less see-through. So you've got a much more solid, rich, dark color is going on in this next layer. And it's really defining the edge of that awning and adding almost what appears to be kind of a wrinkly effect in the middle of the fabric. Naya is going to take that same rich dark blue color, the one that has less water mixed into it, and shade the front of that fabric awning with a little bit more ultramarine blue. Again, when you use less water to apply that first bit of color, you're going to have a much darker color, much less see-through. And then she cleaned out her brush and kind of pulled from that color over to the other side of the painting. This is going to allow her to blend the color into the background as she goes. Naya let the painting dry for a few minutes, and now she's adding another layer of ultramarine blue to the top of the awning. She wanted to make sure that the awning was drier so that as she really richens up and deepens this color and moves it outward, it's not going to lift the layers underneath. So once she applied the color, she then rinsed and blotted her brush and began to blend it outward. When you're blending that color outward, you'll notice that what she's doing is kind of touching from the edge of that color and bringing it out towards the middle of the awning. The beauty of watercolor is that it is gorgeous whether you fully blend it out or you kind of just let the color settle and sit there. So what she's done is she's not fully softened this layer. She's really allowing it to kind of create some depth and dimension by just pooling in the area that it sits. It's very, very easy to overblend watercolor, so sometimes it's nice to just let the color sit where you've applied it and create kind of its own magic. The blue awning on this painting is important because we have so much brown around the building and on the building itself. So the blue really kind of brings everything to life and gives us that contrast that we need to make it really beautiful. As you're kind of looking at the rest of the composition, again, you definitely do not need to overblend these areas. These are areas where it's just as beautiful to kind of let them sit and let the magic of watercolor happen. And sometimes when you're adding additional shadows, it's really just about tapping in some darkness into that very, very deep corner. Every time you paint one of these, it will look different. And so that's kind of part of the process that you want to embrace, is to allowing those differences to show. We're going to add additional deeps on the scalloped edges and up on the left-hand side of the awning, and then just streaking it in towards the middle of the awning area. Just going to rinse our brush out and make sure that we have a nice clean color We're going to be working with cerulean blue on our window panes. And so what's really nice is the contrast between the two blues. Ultramarine blue is a much warmer blue than cerulean. And cerulean sort of leans a little bit more to the green family. It's a beautiful, beautiful blue, often used in skies and in, of course, landscapes and oceanscapes, or seascapes. So what she's doing here is applying that cerulean on the left and again working it over to the right-hand side. Regardless of how familiar you are with light sources and shading and highlighting, sometimes it's nice to just kind of give yourself a rule of thumb where you put all your darks on the left and all your lights on the right. It may not be 100% accurate depending on kind of what's over top of the building, where the trees sit, but it gives a beautiful, consistent light source style look to the painting itself. And that's what Naya is doing here. She's essentially putting her darker shadows on the left-hand side of a variety of different elements and then moving over to the right-hand side with less and less paint in her brush to blend and work that color outward, leaving a lighter look on the right and a darker look on the left. You don't need too much color on the window panes. It's up to you how much you add. It's intended to be a translucent effect, but you can take a little bit of darker color and just tap it into some of those corner areas, especially because the awning would be partially covering that window, so you might see a little bit of shadow coming up underneath it. And we're just dragging some of that color down. Same goes for the right window pane. Just a little bit of darker cerulean and a little bit of darker color underneath that tree where the tree sits. And sometimes you're adding additional color, not so much because it's a shadow, but because you're just giving additional interest in making sure you have great shape and depth and dimension. A little bit more under the awning. And it's important to break up those trees a little bit and to make sure that in a window pane, because depending on what's behind it, you may have some cross-directional strokes going on, some downward and upward and some horizontal to kind of give the appearance of shimmering glass. A really cool effect is to take a little bit of white acrylic at the end and put some diagonal strokes through a window to make it look like there's actually light glinting off of the window in a different direction, which is a really, really pretty effect. We use gouache and acrylic quite often for white highlights. As we continue to kind of vary these blues and give ourselves a little bit more depth and dimension, everybody who's painting is going to like either more or less contrast. So Naya paints with more contrast than I paint, and you'll notice that she has probably more layers glazed onto her paintings, and she uses more opaque paint than I do. I use very, very transparent layers. So it's just a style difference. There's no wrong or right, and her style has a lot of punch to it and a lot of vibrance in the color mixes and a lot more contrast when she's laying it over the surface. You can actually see throughout the pages in this book a variety of different styles depending on the contrast level in that area. So playing with contrast using more translucent layers or darker layers is going to give you unique effects. She's returning back to her burnt umber here, letting the window pane dry, letting the awning dry completely and making sure that those areas are dry. And just taking some darker color now that the wood is dry and accentuating over top of it where we see the lines of the tree. If she had tried to put this opaque burnt umber on while the wood was wet, it would have just kind of blended in and merged. So really important before you put the tree trunks on that your brown wood of the shop window itself and the wood around it is super, super dry. Then you can layer opaque paint over top and have it look very, very defined. There's very, very little water in this layer of paint. It's really quite solid. Then in the areas around some of the indented molding on the wood, of course, a more opaque layer to make sure that it stands out. She's applying that on both sides to make sure both sides of the molding stand out and that we can see it. Underneath the awning here, what we've got is some additional shadow. So first Naya applies the color and then uses the brush to drag that color down to give more accentuated wood grain. In a layering process, again, she needed to make sure that the first layers of wood were dry so that these next ones sit more opaque and have more contrast. We're going to paint our little pots now. Again, just a little bit of very transparent burnt umber just to fill them in. Kind of moving just in a side-to-side motion, very relaxed, very loose style in the pots. As we progress, we let each preceding layer dry and continue kind of adding additional details on layers in a variety of different areas. So underneath the awning, we want to make sure that we're kind of on those scalloped edges, some fairly opaque and solid ultramarine blue, using the tip of the brush just to divide them from the window behind it. It's amazing how similar these two blues can look on a palette, but when you get them on the surface and the watercolor paper, just how different they are. That's why it's so important to have two of every primary color when you're mixing or painting. It just gives you lots of freedom and flexibility. Now we begin with a little bit of sap green, and we're going to make sure that we have a nice transparent layer of sap green to begin, not too transparent, but enough that it's not completely opaque when it's going on, and that's because we're going to layer shadows. So your first layer needs to be lighter, and we're going to begin by making sure that we get, and honestly, I think in many cases, the flowers and the plants in this project are kind of the hero. So we're going to begin by just tapping in a little bit of green around where those pink flowers will sit. You could do the pink first and do the green after. In this case, Naya chose to do the green first and leave the remainder open for the pink flowers. Either way is right. And she's doing the same thing on the tree, is just establishing some of those green bits. And I would guess the rationale for her doing the green first is that if you went on and did a whole bunch of pink, you might completely lose sight of where the green should be established. So it's a good idea to kind of make sure that you know where it's going to be. Now, of course, your little plants on the windowsill are going to be bright, beautiful pops of green. She's leaving a little bit of white space there to act as highlight, and she made sure that she didn't do the blue window all the way down. Otherwise, the green would have looked darker and less like a spring green. You want to remember with watercolor that when you layer, if there's a layer of color behind where you paint, it's going to show through and change the hue of what you're painting. So had she done the blue window too far and too dark behind those green leaves, it would have dramatically changed that spring green color to something much darker. You want to make sure you rinse your brush before you move into your permanent rose. And a good rule of thumb might be to make sure that that green is dry enough that it's not going to merge too much with the pink. Naya often allows her colors to merge a little bit, and that's also really, really pretty. So it just depends on what look you want. Permanent Rose is a beautiful, cool toned red. It is one of our split primary colors. So when we use reds, we use a Permanent Rose and a Cad Red Pale or Cad Red hue of some kind. And Permanent Rose is the pinker, more violet toned red that we use quite often. When you're painting these flowers, she's allowing her brush to run out of paint as she goes. What that does is deposit more color in what she envisions to be a shadow area and less color throughout the other areas of the flowers. It gives variety, it gives depth, it gives dimension, and it shows kind of a light, medium, dark in the flowers without necessarily having to do multiple layers. There isn't a technical term for this technique, it is essentially the application of little dots and dashes and kind of dabby bits to create form and dimension. If you take a look at a painting by Monet, you're going to see a million looking little dots that kind of compile together. They weren't perfect dots. So pointillism, which is what this technique is actually called, is the application of dots or dashes or small lines to create form, depth, and dimension. And that's what Naya is doing here. She's using those dots to create both the form and shape of this vine or tree or whatever you envision it to be, and to create dimension through the use of additional layering, colors, etc. She's now continuing to paint the little potted plants and flowers. And just filling in that space. Again, she did not paint the burnt umber behind them. If she had, she would have had a much darker, more rose-toned pink. She left that space blank to make sure that she kept the pink nice and pure. You could always go back in and add more burnt umber to fill in any gaps, but the white space actually allows for additional looking highlight. She could also always go back in and add more greens if she wanted, but this is really pretty as it is. It's nice and loose, and gives the suggestion of really beautiful flowers. As we progress painting the flowers, it doesn't really matter if they're still wet, not still wet, if we're just going to pop in a little bit of additional color in different areas. So what Naya is doing now is taking a little bit of green mixed with a bit of that pink and kind of deepening some of the green areas inside the flowers. And you don't want to fill in every single space, but it's good to kind of fill in some spots. Got a little bit more permanent rose with less water in it. It's a much more opaque mixture to add some little shadowy bits on the right hand side of the tree there. So she's just dabbing in a little bit of that color and popping it in there to give herself a little bit of shading. So the white space is your highlight, the first layer was your medium, and the additional tints of color are going to be your shadow color. And she's doing that also on the pots flowers, just to give it a little bit more shading. Once you've allowed that color to kind of sit for a little bit, grab a little bit more green. And you want fairly opaque green, not too transparent. And we're going to do the same thing we did to the flowers to the greenery in the pots on the windowsill, which is just to add a little bit of shading in some areas. There's really no rhyme or reason. The whole goal is to make sure that you have a variety of different values. So you have your medium, your light, and now Naya's adding the dark. That dark is often going to be found kind of at the base where it falls into the pot and then up the sides just a little bit, making sure we leave some white space and some medium tones in there for value scale. Naya's let the painting dry fully before continuing with layering. Back to our burnt umber now that everything is dry, and that's the beauty of watercolor, is that you don't have to wait days and days for it to dry. It's dry in about 10-15 minutes. She's really let that sit so she's sure that she gets nice opaque color on these little pots. So you can begin to add some solid burnt umber on each little pot, and then she's just blending it downward a little bit. As we continue throughout, we've got more burnt umber flowing into some of these areas, And it's always good to kind of take a step back and evaluate whether or not you need more color, just to make sure we don't overdo it. So sometimes if we've been sitting there painting something for too long, we'll just keep adding more and more and more color, and we may not need it. So it's good to just take that little step back and make sure we've got the value scale and the dimension that we want. Sometimes it's nice just to add just some really sharp lines to define different areas that we can come through and do as we go. We're going to get a nice layer of burnt umber on those larger pots. So you can take your number 2 round, and we're just adding some burnt umber to each pot itself. Essentially, it's a full wash, kind of filling in that area to get us the underlayer that we're looking for. It's relatively transparent, so you've got a fair bit of water in it, and yet you don't have enough water to kind of drip back over top. At this point, we're essentially in the detail stage, which is probably my favorite stage, because we really get to kind of bring things to life, redefine edges, create more depth and dimension, and just kind of tie everything together in a really, really beautiful way. So burnt umber in some of the darker shadow areas. You could outline some of the edges with it using your number 2 round. Sometimes it's nice to come in and paint the molding or the trim a consistently darker color, as she's doing here with this section. So you get to play and decide kind of where that depth and dimension comes in each one of your own paintings in Cozy Cafes. The pots here have a nicely defined set of kind of planks. So just with a quick dark stroke on each one, you can kind of define those bottom planks really, really cleanly, and then make sure it's sitting neatly on the ground. And you can see here with just a very limited palette and a few colors, you get really beautiful variations in color by layering and playing with the transparency of your paint. We're still using burnt umber, and we're adding additional shadows and details throughout the remainder of the pots, just to make sure that we have good contrast on the lip of the pot and the bottom of the pot and each one of those planks. And Naya's beginning on the left pot now to add the same dimension and details throughout. We're going to take the brush and use the tip to pull those planks downward, and just continue ensuring that the bottom of the pot has good, strong placement and definition. Throughout the entire painting, you can take whatever color was used in any given area and add additional shadows to it, or you can tint with other colors. So what Naya's doing here is just taking almost straight burnt umber with no water and pulling that color down to look and mimic the look and feel of wood grain. And she's going to do that throughout all the areas related to the wood grain in the front and around the trim and the moldings. This is an important step because these final dark additions really add that bit of depth that's going to sink those corners into the background in a beautiful way. And Naya's just going to continue to place additional color, shadows, depth, and dimension throughout the remainder of the wood grain, the window, the awning, and the flowers. In the middle of the window here, one thing that that was not done on the original that Naya obviously noticed when she repainted the piece is that the center frame of the window was unpainted. And it's pretty unpainted. It just looks like trim on the inside of the window. But what she's doing here is just reestablishing it in burnt umber. She obviously felt like it needed to match the trim and the molding and the wood on the outside of the Cozy Cafe. So what she's done is just put a little thin strip of burnt umber in the middle there to make sure that it looks like the exterior of the building has wood trim on it. Sometimes when we paint something later that we've done before, it really gives us an opportunity to kind of play with it, change it, amend it, and do the things we want to do to make it really look as finished as we want it to be. One of our final stages is to ground the Cozy Cafe with a beautiful mix of Payne's Gray and water that's very, very soft. Payne's Gray is just a gorgeous gray color with a bit of a blue tone in it. And what Naya is doing here is applying this color almost as a shadow underneath the pots and the building to make sure that it looks as though it's sitting on the ground. And this is an important step to give your piece a much more finished look. And you want this to be a bit sketchy, a bit imperfect. You want to vary the tones and the color to kind of look like that street is coming forward towards you. You can come as far as you like. In this painting, she didn't go overly far with it. She just kind of made sure that she grounded the fascia of the corner cafe so that it sits firmly planted on the ground. And that's about it for this beautiful little painting. As she kind of continues to apply and blend and glaze and create details, the point of these books, we call them workbooks because they give you the chance to work through a variety of different techniques and finishes. But really, you want to make it your own and experiment, play with color, and just enjoy the process. Thank you so much for joining us for this tutorial today. We are really, really super honored that you chose to watch, and we can't wait to see you next time.